All right, in this second vid, I kind of want to address noise. Noise is a huge tool. It is. A lot of times you'll hear about people trying to get noise out of tracks, but it can also be a huge tool to help shape a timbre or a mix. You know, some noise in there can really help shape it, you know, to make it sound really good. To really kind of even out, if you watch the last video, that you understand a little bit about using different types of distortion and disfiguring, causing harmonic distortion in different ways to saturate differently. And then noise on top of that, mixed with that, can really help you sculpt some really cool saturations. And they're both really simple tools that basically cover the ground with saturation, whatever you're dealing with. And from a very simple aspect, some of the applications can be very complex, but the actual applications in these two videos are very understood. Does that make sense? There's no mystery knob. You know exactly what's happening there, and you can hear when you're making adjustments, and you've got a pretty good idea of what's happening. Noise is one of those things that are kind of difficult because so many people spend so much time in audio engineering. If you study audio engineering, how much time that you're going to spend trying to figure out how to get noise out of things. You don't want no dang noise nowhere. Does that make sense? So, but in music, sometimes you do want some noise. And, real quick, I'm going to address like types of noise. Types of noise. You've got like white noise. You've got like violet noise, pink noise, gray noise, brown noise, red noise, blue noise. And they look different, You've got like white noise, and this is like a violet noise. This is like a blue noise. This is like a pink noise. This is like a gray noise. This is like a brown noise. And they all sound differently. I mean, if you listen to the white noise, and you listen to the violet noise, and you listen to the blue noise, and you listen to the pink noise, and you listen to like the gray noise, and the brown noise, red noise, it sounds like the ocean, that they're different, and they're going to do different things to your track. And if you take a sinusoid and put it on an oscilloscope and then start adding noise into it, different types of noise, you'll see how it starts breaking it up and it starts waving it around. And sometimes in different degrees that it doesn't actually do distortion, kind of warping the actual sinusoid or the complex waveform. It starts putting like little, hair on it. You know what I'm saying? Little hair all over it. Just distorting it, just kind of, the distortion is a much more, if it's not, super heavy in there, that it just starts to try to fuzzy up that sinusoid, which it'll do to your complex waveform that is your mix or your timbre also. And that's really cool to stick it on there and look at it and see what that's doing to it, because it's a huge tool to help you soften something up or brighten something up, or to dirty something up, that complex waveform, but you don't really want to distort it to where you're actually distorting the waveform, but you just kind of want to rough it up a little bit, Does that make sense? And put a little fuzzy hair on it, and I know that's a strange analogy, but, I see it like that because it's like, I see things like a painter, and it's like it's got this blue with this fuzzy hair on it now, and it's so cool, and it's like, those kind of things, it's a huge tool. And if you look at it that way, that it's an invaluable tool, and mixed with the distortion you did from the last video, the harmonic distortion you've done, that now you've got this other tool to help fuzzy up the waveform, or dirty it up just a little bit on the edges, to help, make it sound, to help glue the mix together, or to give the harmonic timbres of the instrument a little bit more rougher edge, or to give it a more silky sound or something like that. A little bit of saturation can do that real well. And a lot of times, instead of putting it on the mix, if you've put it on those instruments back a couple steps and really worked on them, that you'll find you probably spend a lot less time or trying to do saturation on your mix. And when you do, it'll be very little. You might go, well, I might need just a little bit of some type of noise in there and some saturation to try to glue it together a little bit, or, dot, 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 dot. Does that make sense? How you hear it and what that means to you. Some people say glue it together, or rough it up, or smooth it out. All those different ways of, mentally perceiving what that's doing are all valid to the individual working on it most of the time. All the time it's valid to them. Whether or not always that it is, it's not, that's debatable, right? But the concept is valid. Does that make sense? So when you're working at it, one of the ways you can work with it is in a sampler. And so you've got these different waveforms, and you can shape them and you know, all kinds of different ways. Does that make sense? And, you know, in different kinds of, how do I say that? Different types of, you know, contouring the actual wave as it goes in there. So if you put it into a sampler that you've got it set up, and you've tried to make a MIDI copy with your Melodyne or something of your track, and now you have, you know, some MIDI information to trigger your saturation behind it. Does that make sense? And that's a cool tool, because then you can start working with your attack, decay, sustain, and release with that saturation on that instrument and its timbres, and really work with it. And actually, all what you can do with that should be fairly self-explanatory if you understand what a sampler is. You know, that you can do all those kind of things with it, with that one basic noise being triggered when you want it to be triggered. So it's not just all the time back behind there, which sometimes would be fine and sometimes it's not. And sometimes you can deal with that with automation on a track, and sometimes it doesn't really work that well. And sometimes you can be going back and looking at your automation. You go, well, I've went and automated it, but on these areas, I'm going to have to slope that and put a parabola there or something, you know, try to slope that off to that, you know, or, you know, does that make sense? Those kind of applications, sometimes that can be real time consuming, and it can be a lot easier to throw into a sampler and get it triggered. And sometimes I do, depending on what I'm working on. But that tool to understand you can do that, and all the aspects of things you can do with a sampler, are available with your noise to help sculpt the saturation of whatever you're working on. And when you're working on a mix, you know, you've got your, you've sat down and worked out, you know, you've got this brown noise mixed with this violet noise that sounds really good, that complements the WIT mix. You know, you've messed around with it, and, you know, and it sounds good, because you can take these and overlap them on top of each other, you know, these different types of noises. And, you know, if your studio has like play overlaps, it'll play both of those one on top of the other, and it'll play both of them. You can adjust them to where you want them. Does that make sense? You want that much of that violet noise mixed with that blue noise, and that sounds about right in the mix, and you've looped an area and it sounds good. Does that make sense? And those kind of tools are just invaluable, because then you can mix and match them, and sometimes that can be a huge tool. And with your automation going through it, and just doing even just simple automations will normally do it, because sometimes noise will be one of those things that you can't even hardly hear, but it's doing something to mix. You know, I mean, it really is doing something to mix, and you can hear that it's actually helping it. But sometimes by itself, it's almost inaudible. Does that make sense? When you're trying to add it to the mix, which sometimes can make it hard to work with, and you have to turn your speakers way up, you know, or down, and up and down, up and down, trying to catch it and see exactly what it's doing in the mix, but the time is well spent. And one of the things about that is that it's simple. It's so simple. It's such a simple tool, because somebody will have this, you know, $30,000 microphone, and they're trying to get that saturation sound. You know, the EQing of the microphone and the frequency response, that's a valid argument, but I like to do my EQ with my EQ. Okay, I mean, I want a microphone that's going to get as clean a capture as possible, and then I want to EQ for that individual or that instrument myself. I don't want to rely on the microphone, because that guy's voice isn't going to be like that lady's voice or that other guy's voice. It's going to be different. And if I spend the time sculpting with EQ, I'm happy with that. If I go grab my $10,000-$30,000 microphones, and it's like, well, that one sounds better than that one, but it's not exactly what I want, so I mess around with EQ. You know, it's this way. I'm being able to deal with all those aspects. You know, I'm able to deal with my saturation and my noise and my distortion, my harmonic distortion, with the two different types of saturation tools we've been talking about, in a very finite way, or a very accurate way, you know, very, very precise. And it's a really cool tool. You can download just about any of those types of noises, probably from the internet, most of them just free. And, you know, just check them, grab a few different ones, and, you know, listen to them and see how they are, you know, in comparison to other ones, and get some good ones, you know, so that you're not have a bunch of garbage you're working with. And, you know, mess around, mixing them, matching them. You know, on mixes, it can be a lifesaver. You can do some automation with some mixture of noises that you put together, And behind there, with the type of saturation you've done with the distortion modeling from the last video and the saturation modeling that you've done, that a little bit of noise back there just makes it. It roughed it up a little bit or smoothed it up or, whatever, put a little fuzzy hairy stuff on it. And, and it just, it's a huge tool. One thing I want to address about that is that can be very complex, but as you work with it and you start getting, files that you put together, I've got this white, violet, blue noise at those levels, I've mixed them, and I've played them together to where, and I've mixed them together to where they sound really good, and played overlaps and then bounced them together, and that worked really good, and sometimes, you'll start to get to files like that, that really will cover a lot of areas, or at least, get you close. Does that make sense? To where you might have to do some adjustment, or you might say, well, it sounds pretty good, but it sounds like it needs a little more red noise in it or something, and I add a little bit of red noise and mess with that, how much of that red noise I can put in there mixed with that other file, to really get it, just nailing it head on. So I'm not going to make this real long. Hopefully those concepts and the concept of noise, that you can kind of understand what I was trying to explain. And those two tools from these last two videos, those are, for the most part, are your basic saturation tools. And using them like this, it's very accurate way of dealing with it. And sometimes it may seem like time consuming, but if you spend the time with it, and if you're going to be a professional mixer or master, that as you get better with it and you use it, that you'll find that you don't spend that much time on it once you really get to using it well and you understand it well and you're really familiar with it because you've spent some time experimenting with it and what it's doing and how much that it can help when you've got this mix that it just, none of your $300, $400, $500 plugins are working, but that does. You got a free blue noise wave file mixed with a violet noise wave file, and that did it. You know what I'm saying? And it's like, and it's very accurate, and you can do a lot of experimentation to really come up with some really cool stuff so that your saturation is very, very, artistically created on your part to really do what you want it to do rather than kind of what you want it to do. So I'm not going to get into that too much more. The applications of what all you can use that for and the ways you could apply that, there's lots of them and lots of different tools that you could use saturation in, samplers and drum samplers and all kinds of things that you can use it in, and different ways you can do this, different ways you can route it. I mean, you can get real complex with it, but the basic understanding, what I'm trying to explain there, with those two tools, that you've got your saturation mapped out to where you can make your saturation any way you want it to complement what you're working on. Complement the instrument, complement the mix, complement a group, you've made a group of violins or you've done some doubling on a group of violins that are, to try to broaden them, and you add saturation to it in a really accurate way and precise way. So I just wanted to hit that with this, the second part of it, and I didn't want to get too complex in it. I wanted to try to keep it fairly simple so it didn't seem like it was overwhelming, the application and how to apply it. That it's not that complicated, and if you really just sit down and think about it a little bit about how you're going to use that and where you're going to use that and experiment actually using it and see what it does. I mean, it can do some really cool stuff. So I hope that helps a lot. I hope that I made that simple enough for you to understand the basic concept of noise and what it can do to the timbre content and to the complex waveforms you're working on, and that it becomes another invaluable tool. Peace, hope, love.